All right. So we are, again, still in the authority of the king. And we are in our section again where Jesus is demonstrating his authority over disease and demons and nature and defilement, and his authority to forgive sins, which we talked about last week. And now we're going to talk about his authority over men and his choosing of Matthew, and also his authority over tradition. So we're just continuing down this path. And again, at the very end, he'll have laid out his resume for being the Messiah, that he has the authority to be the Messiah. So if you remember correctly, the last thing that we had was that Jesus was in the house of Peter. And he had all the Pharisees that had come all the way from all around Israel, so much so that people couldn't even get into the house, right? They didn't just send a delegation. They just came from all over the place, particularly from Jerusalem, and they were in Peter's house. Now, this next event, this choosing of Matthew, happens right after that. So right after he has healed the paralytic in Peter's house, then he leaves and he finds Matthew. So the situation that we're going to talk about tonight, both situations likely happened in the same day. In fact, it's extremely likely that all three of the situations, the healing of the paralytic we had last week, the choosing of Matthew, and the discussion about fasting and tradition, happened within the same 24-hour period, same day. And there's going to be kind of a tie in here that I want to point out to you about that. Now I'm going to go ahead and read from Matthew, because again, this is the choosing of Matthew. So this is Matthew's account of his own his own selection as one of the disciples of Christ. And it says, as Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. And as Jesus reclined at table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But when he heard it, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I came not to call the righteous, but sinners." Okay, so this is what we have, is Matthew's account of his own calling as a disciple. Welcome, gentlemen. All right, so here's the setting again. The paralytic has just been healed at Peter's house. Jesus then leaves. And of course, remember, when Jesus healed the paralytic, he made the statement, or he did the action which only God could do. And of course, the Pharisees recognized that, and they said that he was a blasphemer, right? So they accused him of blasphemy. So then after that event, he's now leaving Peter's house, and in Capernaum, the same town where Matthew lived. Again, Peter's house is in Capernaum. So in the same town, as he's leaving, somewhere along the route, he runs into Matthew. So again, these are happening on the same day, the healing of the paralytic and the choosing of Matthew, right? And it says again, as he passed, he went out again beside the sea, and all the crowd was come to him, and he was teaching them. And as he passed by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. So in Mark's account, we actually get that he went out, out from where? Out from Peter's house, where he'd healed the paralytic, to the sea, and there was a crowd was coming to him, right? He'd just healed this paralytic, so the crowd's coming to him, and he was teaching them, right? And then as he's passing by along the sea here, he sees Levi, the son of Alphaeus, at the tax booth. And he just tells him, he just says two things: "Follow me." That's it. Right? That's it. That's the command. Yes.
Why the difference in Matthew, where it's Matthew, and in the other two books it's Levi?
Levi. We're going to get to that here in just a moment. Yeah. No, that's okay. No. Yeah. Okay. So what we have here is that we don't know exactly what the relationship has been perhaps between Jesus and Matthew. In fact, we've got zero indication that Matthew and Jesus had ever interacted. It's highly likely, in fact, I'd say it's almost certain that Matthew knew about Jesus, right? Because as a tax collector, he would sit at the customs tax And he would have all these people that would come through. Remember, Capernaum was on that main highway. So he'd hear all these things that Christ was doing from all these people, right? Just from that. And of course, he lives in the town of Capernaum, and Christ has done many miracles now in Capernaum. So even if Matthew and Jesus have never met, it's almost entirely certain that Matthew knows Christ. And I would say it's highly likely that Matthew might have even wanted to become a disciple or to follow him, but because he is a tax collector, he's forbidden by law from doing that. So he can't even make the step towards Christ to become Christ's disciple. So the only way to become a disciple then would be for Christ to call to him, right? So we've got this happening right here with Matthew. And what we see here is that this is really that culmination of the healing of the leper and the paralytic that probably has Matthew's attention. All right, now a couple things to remember here is that the healing of the paralytic and the calling of Matthew, and also the healing of Peter's mother-in-law, right, and the healing of the nobleman's son, that was all Capernaum, right? And so Christ has done lots of now things, casting out demons he cast out in the synagogue in Capernaum, right? And so Capernaum becomes his base, and he does so many miracles here in Capernaum. And if you remember when we talked about Capernaum way back when, we talked about the fact that it was on the Via Maris, which was this trade route that would go all the way down into Egypt, and it would go all the way up and wind up through Israel, and then from Israel up into Mesopotamia. And so if you wanted to get anywhere, this was the trade route, right? And so whoever controls the trade route controls all the money. So what you would have then is Capernaum was this major stop along that trade route as it went around the Sea of Galilee up, out, and then into the Mesopotamian area. And so because of that, you'd have lots of traffic, which is why we talked about why did Christ pick Capernaum and not Nazareth, his hometown? Because Nazareth is just up in the mountains. It's like no one goes there. No one wanted to go to Nazareth. They didn't want to be from Nazareth. It wasn't a good location. Christ picks the place like where people are going to be coming through in Capernaum, right? Now, Matthew is a tax collector, and because he's a tax collector in the region that he's in, he works for Herod Antipas. That's his boss, right? I mean, it's not his immediate boss, but that's his boss, right? Is Herod Antipas, and he was the ruler of Galilee. So he's a tax collector for the Romans. All right. Now, what do we know about tax collectors? Because, this is really important here with what is the reaction that's going to happen with the Pharisees towards Christ, right? All of us probably know tax collectors aren't really highly regarded, right? But a tax collector was regarded by the Jewish people as a traitor, right? Because they were working for the occupiers, the Romans. That was their employer, right? They weren't just helping them, they were actually working for them. And not only were they working for them, they were stealing from their own people. Okay, so they were able to get money from their own people at their people's expense, live high on the hog, and support the Romans. Now, again, remember the Romans at this point, if you were a Roman citizen, not an occupied Roman person in Roman occupied territory, but a Roman citizen, you didn't have to pay tax. So the Romans were living high off the hog off of all of the subjugated people. And so the Jews looked at these tax collectors as traitors. They were working for the enemy, right? So that was one of the things. Yes, Mike, did you have something you wanted to?
You said that he was stealing from his fellow Jews. Can you expound upon that? What do you mean he was stealing?
Sure, I got some slides here. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know the answer, but no, believe me, I'll get to it. Yeah.
So my question is, why did they have Jews be the tax collectors? Why wouldn't they have, if they had Romans come in and occupy, why wouldn't the Romans have brought their own tax collectors? Why did they hire Jews?
Well, the reason for that is because you've got.
Because they don't have to pay these, you didn't have to pay the Jews.
Yeah.
The Jew would take more money from the people to line his own pockets. And so that's why he was despised amongst them.
I mean, if you think about, if you think about the Roman occupation, I mean, there's not the amount of Romans that are alive in comparison to the amount of territory they have. There's not enough people. So they always used different people groups as mercenaries, as soldiers, right? So in other words, you had Roman citizens, you had others that you would employ to do your work. And so in this case right here, you're not going to send, you only have certain limited resources. You're going to try to find people within that area that can do the work for you. And you don't really have to pay them much because their wages become what they steal from their own people. Right. So, hey, as long as you give Rome what Rome deserves, you take whatever you want from your own people. That's your wages. Right. So you kind of get like free labor. Right. So there's reasons for them doing it. But part of it is just logistics. Like you just don't have enough people to do every single job within all of the Roman Empire. So you have to use subjugated people that will then be friendly to Rome because of what Rome could provide you. Right. Okay. So anyway, it was not lawful under Jewish law to be a tax collector. So this was forbidden by the Sanhedrin. This was forbidden by Jewish law to be a tax collector. So when you decided to become a tax collector, you were breaking Jewish law. And because of that, you were expelled from society, right? So it's not just that it was a profession that people just would hate your guts for, basically. You were actually breaking law and going against what the Sanhedrin said would do that. And so because of what these tax collectors would do to their own people, they were very hated. They were the lowest, in fact, they're the lowest of all of the Jewish society, the most hated out of all of them, right? Now, it was also because it was unlawful to be a tax collector, it was also unlawful then to associate with tax collectors. So according to Jewish law, you weren't allowed to associate. So look, if your brother's a tax collector, guess what? You got to cut it all off. That person is excluded from Jewish society and you're not allowed to associate with them. Well, okay, yeah. Unless you're another tax collector. No, I mean, but the prostitutes and the tax collectors were also excluded, so you could associate with other fellow tax collectors, yes. And other dregs of society, as people might call it, that have been discarded from society and that no one will associate with. But by law, you weren't allowed to associate with tax collectors, right? Because of them being traitors, right? Now, there's the two types of tax collectors, and one of them is more hated than the other one, right? The first one is the income tax, right? They're the one that collects tax based off your income that would typically be in an agrarian society, what you grow a certain tax on, your crops or your sheep or whatever else. It'd be that type of tangible thing. And that would be collected on an annual basis or perhaps other frequency, but it wasn't collected all the time. The second one, which is the most hated, are the customs tax collectors or the toll tax collectors, right? And they're the most hated because guess what? Anytime you go past that toll with anything, you got to pay them. So I don't know if I've been in some cities in the US where there are toll booths every single mile. I don't remember, I was in Chicago in some areas. And literally, I drive for a mile and there's a toll booth. I'm dumping money in. I'm driving. And it's like another mile down the road, there's another toll booth. It was nothing but just toll booths. There are areas there. This is why they're hated, because just to do business, just to move stuff from one place to another, you're going to get dinged every single time. This is way more annoying, and you're going to pay way more money to these customs tax collectors than you would to the guy that's going to come to you once a year or so and try to collect your income tax. Does that make sense? So they were really hated for what they did. But the problem is you can't do anything. You can't transport goods. You can't in an agrarian society where that's what you're transporting. We're not talking about money over a computer here. We're talking things have to go from A to B. This is where you have to pay the tax, right? And it says it's like agricultural, it's rural, it's sheep, it's cows, it's raising corn and wheat.
Yeah, you're eating a living, right?
Yeah, they were an agrarian society. So most people were farmers, or what we might call ranchers, sheep herders.
So I would imagine they raised some of their own, right, for their own consumption.
Well, they would, but then if you try to sell that, right, to make a living,
I'm just thinking these
Yeah.
people couldn't have made a lot of money.
they didn't. But that was the problem. You already have people that are really kind of, many of them are sort of just living to make ends meet. That's all they're able to do. And then when you have to tax them, You're taking money from the already poor and you're basically making them destitute. So that's why these tax collectors were looked at poorly, because they lived high on the hog. I mean, these tax collectors lived in the best houses, the best clothes, and so everyone just hated them. They were the ultimate example of someone that was, stealing money from people and using it for their own benefit, right? That was where they're at. So, but it,
The religious leaders, the Pharisees, the rabbis, they must have been taxed as well, right?
yeah, they didn't like it either. But
Yeah.
they also, I'll give some things here. They actually permitted breaking the law because the tax collectors were hated so much that the rabbis actually excused certain behavior that would normally,
For themselves.
no, for the people. Yeah. In other words, they permitted certain things to be done that would normally be considered against the Mosaic law, or to basically steal. They allowed the people to do what they would need to do in order to not pay the taxes if they could get away with it, right? Okay. Anyway, but so anyway, the point here is that Matthew, and it said that Matthew's sitting at the toll booth or the customs booth. So Matthew isn't an income tax collector. He's sitting there at the toll booth. So he's the worst of all the tax collectors. He's the most hated, right? So that's where we see here that he is sitting at this tax booth, right? When Christ runs into him. So he's there and he's collecting stuff, right? And this is sort of where we meet him at. Now, again, going back into some of the tax collectors, they're also called publicans, public servants, publicans. Publicans, not Republicans, publicans. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And basically, when John the Baptist, you remember that when John the Baptist was originally preaching to the people, one set of people were these tax collectors, and he told them, go and extort no more, right? When they would come to repentance, and some of them did, that's what he told them. Don't go and extort more than what you're supposed to. Now, John didn't say don't collect taxes, which of course rubbed some people in the wrong way. But he just said, don't extort more than what you're supposed to. Like if Rome told you to, hey, take 15%, the tax collector would take 30%, give 15 to Rome and, take 15 for themselves, right? And Rome allowed them to get away with it. And here's a quote here. It says, the reason someone became a tax collector was not because the job paid well, because remember, the Romans are kind of using them for free labor, right? But it's what Rome allowed them to get away with. If the Roman authorities decided that a person owed the government 5 shekels in taxes, the publican would collect 10, give 5 to Rome, and keep 5 for himself. Publicans became wealthy by extorting from their own people. In Greek, these head tax collectors were called architelones, and the tax collectors on them were called telonai, most of whom were Jews, right? So you had these Romans that were kind of the head bosses, and then they would sort of form out or hire these Jews as these local tax collectors. The architelones farmed out their territory to the telonai, who in order to make a profit inflated the amount to be collected. Those whose business forced them to travel had to pay taxes every time they entered a new region or territory. This and the fact that Rome did not prevent arbitrariness and abuse of power led to Judaism reacting with extreme distaste to those who took up this vocation, right? So this is Matthew. Matthew's he's a bad guy. He's in it for the money. He doesn't care if he's hurting other people. He doesn't care if his own people are starving. He doesn't care that he's helping the oppressors of his people. Matthew's in it for the money. Now, Rich, to your point, the rabbis didn't like this any better than anybody else. Now, what they did say is, hey, look, there were some like the zealots who actively opposed Rome. Like they would kill people. Like they would be the ones that would go out and kill people, right? But for the most part, the rabbis didn't, advocate for that. But what they did say is, hey, look, what they're doing is not lawful. The collecting of these taxes is not lawful. So they will allow them to do unlawful things. Like you could lie, like, oh, no, I've only got, if you could find a way to, bring your cart there and, find a way to lie or hide or, some sort of subterfuge against the tax collector, they would absolutely go ahead and say, do that. In fact, you're actually doing a righteous thing by doing this. So they would advocate for things like lying, which again would go against what they would normally say is correct, right? Now, the rabbis, they didn't like them anymore. In fact, this is going to be part of their hatred towards the tax collectors is in line with the Jewish people. They compared them in some of their passages to a plague of locusts. Now that harkens back to the plagues in Egypt, right? You got the locust plague. You've got the fact that they were considered the worst of sinners, like the very bottom of the barrel. Like there are sinners and then there's tax collectors, right? So Matthew is one of those people, right? And again, Mike, to your point, the only people that these tax collectors were allowed to associate with would be other tax collectors, okay? So this is sort of the setting that Christ is entering into when he passes by Matthew, who is doing his job at the customs booth.
So if by Jewish law, tax collectors could only associate with other tax collectors, would their social group be with Romans, or did the Romans not even mingle with the tax collectors?
Romans didn't like him either. I mean, their social group would be with each other. I mean, when you have ostracized yourself, you hang out with the rest of the people that are ostracized. That's just the way it is. No one else will accept you. The Romans, you were just a tool for the Romans, and that was it. Romans didn't like you. Romans didn't care they didn't care anything about you. As long as you gave Rome the taxes, you weren't part of their clique. But
pretty small social group.
A very small social group. In fact, what we're going to see is that when Matthew gets his friends together to celebrate being found by Jesus, who does he invite? Tax collectors and sinners. Why? Because no one else, he has no friends. He's got no one else. Like that's his associates are other people that are equally ostracized by society because of who they are, right? And I'm not saying in a wrong way, like tax collectors were bad. Like these people were greedy, dirty people, right? What they did was horrible, right? Okay, so there's a reason for at least the tax collectors being ostracized. And what we see is that, of course, when Christ does sit down at the feast, there are other tax collectors, and it says sinners. Now, sinners can be a euphemism for two things, or a euphemism for one thing. In general, a sinner, according to the rabbis, was someone who was an unrighteous person who didn't follow the law, the Mosaic law. Well, that's the euphemism. So just a sinner in general was someone who had disregard for the law, the Mosaic law and the Pharisaic law. Like they were the person that was just a complete law unabider. That was a sinner. Now, in some cases, and in fact, the case with Matthew, it is actually a euphemism for prostitutes. So in this case, when we get to Matthew's account, it's not just tax collectors, but there are also likely prostitutes that there's as well, part of this group, right? So that's what we have. All right. So there's the picture. Christ has left Peter's house. He's now by the Sea of Galilee, and he's passing by the roadway that now has this customs tax booth there, and Matthew is sitting there. And it says that he was Levi, the son of Alphaeus. Now, it's interesting, Matthew doesn't actually call himself Levi. And I think it's because Matthew doesn't want to be remembered by who he was. Like, Matthew was born Levi. His Hebrew name is Levi. He is the son of Alphaeus. But at some point, his name gets changed to Matthew. Now, we're not told in the biblical account how that happens. But it's interesting that Mark calls him Levi, the son of Alphaeus, but Matthew himself doesn't identify him that, because Levi would have been how he was known in the community as the tax collector. That dirty tax collector, Levi. Right? So the assumption is that he himself changed his name. Now, it's also possible that Christ changed it too. We're not told. Just like when Christ called Peter, right? Okay, he changed his name, Cephas, Peter, right? So we don't know whether or not Christ changed after his conversion or Matthew did, but likely Matthew is his post-conversion name that he took on and changed. Just like Saul became Paul, Peter, Cephas. Levi becomes Matthew, right? And
Book here says that Levi means a gift of Yahweh.
yeah, it's right up there. Yeah. So
That's probably why he used the name Matthew.
yes, yeah, the Matthew, either he changed it or Christ changed it, but Matthew then means, yes, the gift of Yahweh. So we're not sure, but it's really interesting that Matthew doesn't use his birth name, and Mark does to identify that, right? Now, what is really, yes, right.
That even goes back to the Old Testament, doesn't it?
Sure,
Yeah.
yeah,
So is
Abram was
so is
changed to
there-
Abraham,
Yeah.
Sarai was changed to Sarah, yeah.
Does that mean anything?
Well, yeah, sure, I mean,
Buy something?
well, when God changes your name, it certainly does. Right? Like when he changed Jacob's name, you know what Jacob's name was changed to? Right? Israel. Yeah, Israel, right? So when God changes your name, it means something. Right? I'm sure other people perhaps change their name for other reasons. We don't know, but certainly it means something when God changes your name. So when Abraham's name is changed, or Sarai's name is changed to Sarah, and when Jacob's name is changed to Israel, and Christ changes Peter's name, correct? There are theological reasons and meanings behind it. Now, what we don't know is we don't know whether or not Matthew did this of his own, or whether or not Christ did it. So I don't want to make too much out of it, although his name does mean the gift of Yahweh, versus Levi would have been the name that would have been given after one of the 12 tribes, right? As a connection to one of the 12 tribes.
Use the name Levi. Because through the rest of the Gospels, he's referred to as Matthew, right? So
Yes.
So why would Mark introduce him as Levi?
Well, I don't know exactly why, because Mark doesn't tell us the reason, but that was his name. So what I think what Mark is doing is Mark is just giving an account that says, hey, Christ is passing by, and Levi was there. I mean, that was his name, right? So when Christ encountered him and when Christ called him, he wasn't Matthew, he was Levi. So I think it's just Mark's just calling out the facts of this man named Levi was sitting there, and it's only later on that we get his name being changed, or we understand that he's now Matthew and not Levi.
I don't know how accurate it is, but and I don't know if many people have seen The Chosen, but The Chosen, represents the apostles, and there's not a lot of them that are real friendly with Matthew, especially at the beginning. And that maybe that's why this is happening, is because their kind of disdain for him, lived through even having Christ die and rise again, and them writing these books. They still kind of had that little, that little thing against Matthew, and maybe that it was like a little dig or something.
Yeah, I mean, Mark. Now remember, Mark wasn't one of the disciples. Mark was the scribe of Peter.
Oh, okay.
So and Mark was with Paul and Barnabas on his first missionary journey. So I don't think that accounts for Mark, because likely Mark didn't really know Matthew until after the resurrection and everything else. So I doubt that had the case there. But I mean, to your point though, I imagine when he's called, it doesn't. We don't get any indication of what the reactions were. And I'm not saying that The Chosen is right or wrong on this, but I think it's probably likely that his other disciples are like, "Are you kidding me?
Right.
Like, we're adding this guy to the band?" Like, I mean, so I wouldn't doubt that there was some initial like nose turning up and some wondering whether or not Christ is really dealing with a full deck. Like, I don't know why you picked this guy. Like, if you try to get some disciples, he's the last person that you'd want to have on your team. So
Peter was complaining about the fact that he picked Levi. And he says, I can't believe you picked him. And Jesus says, I picked you.
oh yeah, you're talking about The Unchosen. Yeah. It's interesting. It would be interesting to sort of be a fly on the wall when that happened. But we don't get any indication from the scriptures that was the case. Now, it's also maybe just as likely that Peter, who even said, like, look, I don't deserve to be here. Like, I don't deserve, Lord, right? Depart from me, a sinner. that Peter would have recognized, hey, look, just that same thing. It might have been Peter that would have recognized, if you chose me, I guess you can choose Matthew. So we actually don't know what the reaction would have
Right.
been, but it's, either one of those might be just as likely as the other. Now, look at this here. It says in Mark 2:15, it says, as he reclined in the table, many tax collectors and sinners were reclining with Jesus and his disciples, and there were many who followed him. So you might miss that point, that when Christ calls Matthew brings a whole lot of people with him. Like he pulls a whole lot of people out of the gutter. You know what I'm saying? Like we can kind of tend to think of it as just being Matthew gets saved and it goes on from there. But what it says here is that of these tax collectors and sinners, there were many who followed him. Well, how did they get into the relationship with Christ and follow him? Because of Matthew. So Matthew's called by Christ. And the one thing that I kind of skipped over this a little bit, which was, where was it? Someplace around here, is that Christ just gives Matthew a command. He says, follow me. Why would Matthew get up and leave a very lucrative business and follow someone? And of course, the scripture doesn't tell us. So I'm just sort of posing that out there. But what this shows is that as soon as Christ said, follow me, Matthew doesn't even complain. He doesn't give an argument. He doesn't say, wait, Lord, let me get my house in order, nothing. He immediately gets up and he follows Christ.
Don't you think that is like a divine?
Well, he must have been.
Like he had no other, there was no other, how else could Matthew have responded? I mean, he
Well,
could have said no, but he didn't, but.
He could have responded like many other people did, which is,
Yeah, but he didn't. And I think that I don't know. I mean, I feel like in some way that was like a divine appointment in, like almost like the woman in the well and the other people, throughout the Old Testament history that God has used for, his kingdom purposes. I mean, Matthew, to me, Matthew, when Jesus called his name,
He was guaranteed unemployment.
well,
Well,
I
well,
understand that it was, I don't know if I can, maybe I can explain this.
All the other guys could.
well, let me just, I mean, here's the thing. We don't know what compelled Matthew because we're not told. We're just said, Christ said, follow me. But, well, because the scriptures don't say, but
He was there in Capernaum, and he probably was aware of, if not had witnessed.
yes.
Some of the miracles.
And he's heard people coming back and forth through his toll booth talking about this guy named Jesus. Now, again, we don't know. So all we can do is speculate here. What I could say is you said, well, how else could he be responded? Well, he could respond like many people responded, which was, remember when Christ, the guy says, hey, wait, hold on just a second here. I got to go back and bury my father. I mean, there's lots of ways that when Christ was calling people the disciples, that they responded in a negative way. So
He called them by name. He called them by name.
he did.
And I just think that.
I'm not saying, I guess what I'm saying, Rich, is we don't know what compelled him to do that. All we know is that his response was immediate. So I guess what I would point out here is that, well,
That instant it was a big deal. But you don't know what you said before, what Matthew might have heard or witnessed.
yeah, we don't know. And I guess the only thing I would draw from that, though, is that there are different responses to Christ. Some will respond positively, like Matthew. Some will respond negatively, like the Pharisees, right? And like other people that Christ will meet who will say, oh, I want to be your disciple. And when Christ says, oh, this is what needs to happen. Oh, no, I don't want that. So what it shows is the different responses to Christ, and two things out of that. Number one, how should we respond? So we want to be like Matthew, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is that we shouldn't get down when we have witnessed to people and talked to people and shown them who Christ is and shown them why they should believe in the Bible and show why they should submit themselves to him. And they just say, don't want it. Because Christ himself personally offers himself to people and he was still rejected. So part of what I'm trying to get at with that is we don't know, but what it is there's an example of what we should do, but it's also an example of how many respond. And we don't have to worry about that. We just have to worry about being faithful. Okay, that's the main
I
thing I
just
say.
think it's cool when you call people by their name, you know, like you mentioned Jacob.
Well, he didn't call him by name.
You say, call him Levi, son of Alphaeus.
No. He passed by Levi. Yeah, he didn't call him by name. He just said, follow me. He didn't. So that's what I'm saying. He didn't. Yeah.
Mom, gee,
Some,
From the movie.
is that from the movie?
Yeah, don't get Hollywood mixed up with the Bible. I'm telling you, as much as I love The Chosen, and I do love The Chosen is wrong on many things. So just read the Bible, use The Chosen for entertainment, grab a bowl of popcorn, but don't use it to your Bible study with. Okay, yes.
I was wondering about the command follow me. Like, would that be a weird thing to hear, or would that be in a normal context? Like if a rabbi were to say, I want you to be my student, would they say something to that effect, or was that kind of out of the ordinary?
In fact, if you go back to when John the Baptist points out that to Andrew and John that Christ is the Messiah, and they follow him at a distance, and what does he say? The rabbi, follow me. They follow him at a distance, and then when he says, I accept you as my disciples, that's their cue to follow him, and they follow him. So it would not have been that would have been understood. I was actually going to say that before you said it. Like the context of follow me has that call to discipleship, right? Of yes, follow me, but it means that you then have to do something. Like there's discipleship. A disciple is a learner of somebody else. It means you have to give up something and you have to devote yourself to that individual. So whatever motivated Matthew was, we don't know exactly, but we do know that's what Christ is saying. Come follow me. And he would have understood that as a call to discipleship. All right. Okay, so anyway, what we see here is that Matthew is called, and immediately after he's called, he follows. And what does he do? He goes to his house and makes a big feast. I mean, he is so excited that he calls all of his friends and says, what? You got to meet this person. You got to meet this person. And they all come. And it's probably the first time many of these people have been invited to any kind of an event that wasn't hosted by one of their own, right? And that's exactly what happens. So he invites his fellow tax collectors and prostitutes, right? This is who Matthew has been hanging out with, right? Now, we have here, Mark also, that it says that there were many who followed him. The other thing that is important about that is it not just that Matthew went out and found these other people and that they followed Christ, but we do get now this indication of a two group of people, because it says they were reclining with Jesus and his disciples, and there were many who were following him. So now we get this first indication that Jesus isn't just calling like general disciples, like anyone who wants to come follow him is a disciple. We now get this idea that there are sort of two groups. There's going to be this inner group of 12 that are his disciples, and there are going to be others that follow him that are also disciples, but they're distinct from the 12, right? And Mark's the first one to give us this sort of bifurcation of this idea of discipleship, all right? Okay, now notice Christ is there and they're feasting, they're eating and they're having drinks and they're just having a whale of a time, and Matthew's probably grinning from ear to ear, and Christ is talking to these other prostitutes and tax collectors, and many of them are following him. And like, what a grand thing that's going on here. These people that have been in destitution, these people that have been thieves and robbers and traitors to their own people are turning. Like they're turning. Their lives are being changed, and there's a party going on. And then what do we get? What's the reaction of the religious leaders? They didn't like it.
They call them scumbags.
That's right. So instead of rejoicing, where they come by and they're looking at it going, gosh, look what Jesus is doing. Like he's turning like these people around. Like I've never seen this happen. They do what many of us do, which is, that's right. Don't like it. How dare he save those people? Like, how dare it? Do you know how bad those people are? Like, it's okay for him to save me, but those people aren't savable, right?
Well, and that's interesting. When we talk about the days and those people.
Yes, the days and those people,
The-
yeah.
The days and those people. 'Cause
Yes.
We got that going on right now,
I know.
big time.
And it's
And that they and those people might be the people that Christ would hang out with,
sure.
or that, he would seek perhaps, I don't know.
Well, even it even goes, it's even a little bit worse than that. It's not just who he'd hang out with, but the problem is that when these people are experiencing new life in Christ and are turning from what they've done, that instead of rejoicing and saying, look what's happening, what do they do? Like it's even worse than that. It's not just that he's associating with them, but they're angry that he's with these people. They're looking at the scene, and instead of seeing joy, instead of seeing lives impacted, they're looking at it and going, can you believe what that guy's doing? Those filthy people. Like this is what's going on, right? So this is the evil that's in their heart that he just spoke earlier in the day when they accused him of blasphemy, right? This is the evil that's been brewing. And it says, and the Pharisees and their scribes grumbled at his disciples, saying, now they're not talking to Christ at this point. They probably got his disciples cornered or, something like that. They're pulling him aside, what's going on with your master here? So they grumbled at his disciples, saying, why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners? Which is, from their perspective, a very legitimate question, because guess what? It's against the law. I mean, these aren't just people that are unworthy of our attention or unworthy of our love and respect. It's illegal. Not Roman law, but Jewish Sanhedrin law. It's illegal. What you're doing is you're breaking the law. And you're doing it with a bunch of filthy people. That's what's going on here. So they're grumbling. Why do you do that? Okay. So what we have here is that I just wanted you to see this. Like we pass by this so often, like he's doing this, but just imagine, here's what's going on. Not only is it illegal, not only are these people that no one wants anything to do with, but when Christ is having dinner with them, particularly, now we miss this a lot in our culture, but if you go over into the Middle East area, having dinner with somebody is a sign of intimacy and fellowship. Right? That's the reason why if you had a stranger that you didn't even know, you're just sitting there, someone comes and knocked on your door, you're obligated to bring them in and feed them and take care of them. Right? You even read that like in the Old Testament, you see these different accounts of that. So because of the sort of law of hospitality was high, and what you see here is then you see Christ actually fellowshipping with them, and there's a closeness that he's showing them, a tenderness that he's shown to them, that is not just that he's sitting there, but he's extending this fellowship that they thought should not be extended to him. And that's this whole thing with the meal.
It says that he was reclining with them.
Yeah.
What does that refer to?
Well, reclining, they in Israel and a lot of places in the Middle East, they don't sit on chairs like you do.
Like we wouldn't sit at a table.
No, in fact, when you see the Last Supper, that's a bunch of baloney, because they didn't have a table like that with chairs.
So they'd be like-
There's a very low table on the floor with cushions all around, and you would recline. You would actually sit there and you recline either on your right or so imagine just laying down
And you might actually be reclining on another person.
or close to them.
Or
Yes,
close to another
yes.
person.
Yeah, you're actually laying down and you're up on either you're up on one arm, usually like your left, let's see, right? I can't remember, right arm or left arm, because I think you might be on your right arm because you eat with your left hand for reasons I won't go into.
Yeah, so it's kind of
Jesus wasn't.
But
Struggled to make
anyway,
sure-
the reclining doesn't have anything to do other than it shows the Jewishness of the story. The Jewish, because every Jew, didn't matter if it's Pharisees or not, you recline.
Significance of having a meal.
Yeah, the significance of the meal, though, is that it was a sign of fellowship and intimacy and closeness. So he's not just saying, okay, I'll sit over here in the corner. I mean, he's shown intimacy with these people that legally he's not allowed to, and socially he shouldn't be doing, right? And so that's what's actually going on here, right? So now, again, these Pharisees here, remember, they are the separatist party of Israel. They do not believe in the Roman occupation. They believe in being separated from the evil. They believe in being separated from the Jews that were not obedient to the Mosaic law and to their own Pharisaic law. So they were a complete separatist in this way, right? In fact, that's what Pharisee means, separated ones. The Pharisee, separated ones. They consider themselves separated from even their own Jewish people who didn't abide by their own rules, right? And so what they see here is they see Christ isn't being one of them. Now, remember what we talked about last week. Who did the Pharisees believe the Messiah would be? Just the main thing. I mean, there's
King.
no. Well,
They believed
yes,
he was gonna be a Pharisee.
that's right. So the Pharisees believed that when the Messiah came, he would be one of their own. And a Pharisee would never associate with these people because they're separatists. Pharisee, to be separated ones. So here you have Christ doing something no Pharisee would do. So immediately after he's done the paralytic and he's proclaimed himself to be God and they're accusing him of blasphemy, he's now separating himself, or he's not separating himself from these people in society. And so the Pharisees are also like, oh, this is what you're not doing, right? So he's associating with people instead of separating himself, right? Now, what does Christ say? But when he heard it, okay, so they're talking to his disciples. Apparently, they don't have enough guts to talk to Christ himself. I'm not really sure what's going on, but they're not. But when Christ hears it, he hears all this grumbling. He responds and he gives this really well-known parable, right? To sort of prove his point. He says, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick, right? Makes sense, right? I mean, everybody understands that right there. Like you don't send a doctor to well people, you send a doctor to sick people, right? So they all knew what he was saying, and they actually agree with the validity of his argument, right? You can't argue with that one right there. But here's the problem. Christ says, hey, look, I came for the sick. And the Pharisees don't believe they're sick. Now, what they should have recognized is, now, of course, Christ thinks they're sick, and they are sick, and they actually need him. But even so, here's where their logic breaks down. If you as a Pharisee were like, look, I'm a Pharisee, I'm separate, I'm holy, I'm not sick, what should you have at least recognized? That the Messiah, who in the Old Testament does come with healing in his wings, does come to heal the nations, to heal the Jewish people, right? To take their sin, Isaiah 53, they should have at least said, well, gosh, you know what? We don't need a doctor, but you're right. Those people need it. So their logic should have at least compelled them to agree with Christ and say, okay, we get it. We get it. You didn't come for us because we're good. That's minimally what they should have done. All right. But this is what he's telling them right here is, I didn't come for the people who think they're well. I came from the people who know they're sick. And until you get to be a Matthew in his situation, and Matthew knew he was sick. Matthew knew he needed Christ. The prostitute knows she needs Christ. These religious leaders, they think they got it all made, right? It's really actually not much different than today, right? It's, you know, you find it in every generation. It's the same type of thing. So now in this case here, I have a little note that, you know, Christ didn't bother to try to figure out who the righteous were, because his point isn't about this. His point is like, hey, I didn't come from the righteous. So he's not even going to bother to argue with the Pharisees and say, you're not righteous and you need a doctor. He's just going to say, look, I didn't come for the righteous, right? I came for sinners. For he said, I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. Okay. Now, what he does say here, which is, I think, interesting, is that he says, go and learn what this means. Now, this is a shot across the bow. This is Christ basically slapping him right in the face, because what he's saying, this term, go and learn what this means, was what a rabbi would say to his students. And he would say it to his students when his students had misunderstood or not properly understood what was being taught. Okay, so if I ask you a question on your test and you say it's A and it should have been B, then as your master, as your leader, your rabbi, I would say, go learn what this means. This isn't correct, go learn. And then they would have to go back and learn. So what Christ is actually telling the Pharisees, remember, the leader of the people is, you're wrong, and guess what? I am playing the role of rabbi, and you are my students. You're to go learn. Now, how do you think they would have, they knew exactly what he was doing. How do you think they would have felt with them saying that to them? Condescending. Oh, how dare you do that? You can't talk to us like that. How dare you put yourself above us? Because it's exactly what he's doing. Go learn, you students who have gotten this wrong. That's exactly what he's saying, right? Now, he says, and he's quoting from Isaiah here, or he's paraphrasing Isaiah, I desire mercy and not Isaiah, Hosea. He says, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, right? So he's appealing back to the Old Testament, saying, wait, hold on a second here. You should know that the sick need a doctor. And you should know what God wants, how he wants you to act. And how does he want you to act? Not in a righteous way of saying, I'm better than, but how does God want you to act? And so he goes back to Hosea, and Hosea says this, for I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings, right? And that's what God is saying through Hosea. Hey, look, I don't need you to bring a whole bunch of bulls. Stop bringing your sacrifices. What I want is you to extend love and mercy to those who need it. That's how God wants you to act. Don't bring me any more sacrifices unless you're willing to be loving, right? So that's what Christ is saying right there, is God's desire is for mercy. And guess what you're showing? No mercy. Right? So he's really calling on the carpet here now, because he's actually quoting from the Old Testament about God's stance towards those who are sinners, right? Now, I already kind of said this last, what's that?
Well, is there an application that, we've said, how does God want them to act? Is that how he wants you to act?
Sure, of course.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's God's, that's how God wants all of us. He wants us to be, I mean, consider when he, why do you forgive others? Question, why do you forgive others?
Why?
There's lots of reasons why you should forgive someone, but why should you forgive someone?
Well, we're told to forgive
Why?
because we've been forgiven.
Because we've been forgiven. That
Forgive
is,
the way we forgives our trespasses as we've been forgiven of ours. I don't know.
that's
what
right.
I'm
No,
saying.
this is exactly right though. So there's lots of reasons why you would want to forgive someone. And we can go into even the pragmatic reasons for that. But the primary reason is because you've been forgiven.
Yeah.
I mean, that's God's stance. So show mercy. Why? Because God's showing you mercy. Like the first time you sinned, God should have wiped you out. And yet God still allows you to live, still allows you to enjoy life, still allows his common grace to dwell upon you, and the rain that we're having out there and the sunshine and everything else. God extends mercy to sinners all the time, in theological ways and in just common grace ways. And that's what he's saying here. It's like, look, you should extend mercy because but they didn't think they needed mercy. See, that's the problem. If you don't recognize your need for mercy or your need for grace, you won't recognize your need for salvation. That's really the heart of the problem. And when you see
Grace toward others.
well, no, if you don't recognize your need for God to extend grace.
Personally had a need for mercy for this.
Yeah, if you think that you've got it made, if you think that you are separate, as the Pharisees did, and you are holy, and you're God's gift to the world, and you don't need anything. You got like God's lucky to have you on his team. Like that's the idea of the Pharisees. Like you're lucky you picked me because I'm your number one player. So if you have that attitude, guess what? You don't think you need to be saved because there's no reason for it. It's when you realize that God has extended you grace and mercy and that you're in desperate need of it, and that you recognize that you need salvation. That's the difference. And that's what Christ is saying here, is that God desires mercy towards those who need mercy. So even if you Pharisees don't think you need it, you should at least be extending it, because that's what God has commanded back in Hosea. Yes, Mike.
Footnote that kind of expands upon that.
Sure.
The Pharisees wrapped their sin in respectability. They made themselves appear good by publicly doing good deeds and pointing at the sins of others. Jesus chose to spend time not with these proud, self-righteous religious leaders, but with the people who sensed their own sin and knew that they were not good enough for God. In order to come to God, we must repent. In order to renounce our sin, we must first acknowledge it. And in this Bible here, all three Gospels says that he came to people who were who thought, I have come to call not on those who think they are righteous,
Mhm.
but to those who know they are sinners.
Yeah, exactly right. And that's what he's saying. Hey, if you think that you're righteous, then you don't need a doctor. If you think you're healthy, you don't need a doctor. I mean, who goes to the doctor unless it's your annual checkup? Who goes to the doctor unless the guy? Yeah, I don't want to. I'm not trucking my behind back into the doctor's office just because it's like, I don't know, it's Monday, I guess I'll go to the doctor. I mean, no one does that. It's like no one wants to sit around and do that. So that's exactly, Mike, what he's talking about here. But this shows that the separation now between those who will come to Christ and don't tends to be along those lines of who realizes that they need Christ and who doesn't. And not need him just because he does really cool things and cool miracles, but because you actually need him as the Messiah. All right, now here's what I want to do. I want to just point out here, because this is we're doing some stacking here to answer the question, why did the religious leaders reject Christ? And we've been kind of stacking this, and I want you to see how every event that we have now goes to that end goal so that it can answer that question, why would they do this to Christ? Okay, so remember, we had the healing of the Jewish leper, and that was the sign that he was the Messiah. And at that point, I think many of the religious leaders came and said, gosh, this might be it. Like we know, Daniel said that this is when he was supposed to come, and look what he's done. He's healed a Jewish leper. So I think many of them came to Simon's house with the hope that perhaps he was. And then when he forgave the man's sins, they're like, you're blasphemy, you're claiming to be God. And immediately that hope that they had got shot down. Now he leaves and he sees Matthew. And of course, now the religious leaders are following along. Like they didn't leave and go back. They're following him along. They're here because guess what? They wind up at Matthew's house. How do you wind up at Matthew's house? Unless you go to the tax collector's house all the time. You don't. You go there because you follow now Christ. So as Christ leaves leaves Peter's house and he goes to Matthew, he's got this crowd of religious leaders behind him. Matthew joins Christ. They go to his house. They come to Matthew's house as well. They're peeking in the windows. They're there. And so not only has he claimed to be God, now he's broken their law by associating with tax collectors and sinners. And not only is he associating, but he's enjoying it. He's extending communion with them and fellowship. He's not separating, he's joining them. And you can just see them like he claimed just a few hours ago that he's God, and now look what he's done. He's one of them. You are who you associate with, right? You heard that? You are who you associate with. You are the worst of the worst. You're a blasphemer, and now you're just a dirty tax collector and a sinner. So, okay, this is so now we've got two Lego blocks stacked on each other. We're going to get to the third one here. And after this third one, it's going to be downhill from here for Christ, right? And so we're going to get to that one, all right? So let's try to finish this one up here with the Messiah's authority over tradition. And then I hope what you can do is you can kind of see, tradition. All right. Okay, so Messiah's authority over tradition. And what we see here, and I'm going to go ahead and read from, well, I'll tell you what, let me read from Luke, because Luke has one that is a little bit, it's a little different. It adds something. So it says, and they said to him, the disciples of John fast often and offer prayers, and so the disciples of the Pharisees, but yours eat and drink. And Jesus said to them, can you make wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in those days. He also told them a parable. No one tears a piece from a new garment and puts it on an old garment. If he does, he will tear the new, and the piece from the new will not match the old. And no one puts new wine into wineskins. If he does, the new wine will burst the skins, and it will be spilled, and the skins will be destroyed. But new wine must be put into fresh wineskins. And no one, after drinking old wine, desires new, for he says, the old is good. Okay? So now notice, and they said to him, then the disciples of John came to him. Where are they coming to him at? Where's he at right now? He's at Matthew's house. So he's healed the paralytic. He's chosen Matthew. He's gone to Matthew's house. And then at Matthew's house, the disciples of John, who by now John's in prison. So why are the disciples of John there? Because John's told them to go follow the Messiah. John's in prison. So now the disciples of John have come to Christ. But the disciples of John are doing things that Christ isn't doing. And so they're watching this, just like the Pharisees had questions, grumbling. The disciples of John aren't grumbling, but they're curious. They're actually concerned that perhaps Christ is doing something he shouldn't be doing. And it's not that he's associated with the wrong people. That wasn't their concern. Their concern was he's not following the tradition of fasting. Because John followed fasting, and guess what? John's disciples followed fasting. But Christ and his disciples don't. And so they're concerned that he's breaking Pharisaic law. Why aren't you doing what you should be doing? So what we get here is we get this thing that's happening within the same day. John's disciples now are watching Jesus sit back, feasting with the tax collectors and sinners, and they come and they ask, hey, why don't you guys fast? We fast. John the Baptist fast. The Pharisees fast, but you guys don't. Okay. So this is what's going on. All right. And of course, Christ gives them an example of that. But I want to wrap this up because I want you to see this all as a whole when we get done. All right. Anyway, so basically the question is, why doesn't he fast and why doesn't he follow? Now, the one thing I want to make abundantly clear, the law about fasting was not the Mosaic law. It was not God's law. This is a Pharisaic law. Okay. So Christ isn't breaking God's commandments. He's not sinning. He's just breaking the law of the Pharisees. It was a Pharisaic law to fast, right? That's the first thing, is why are you not obeying the Pharisaic law that we all obey, right? Okay. Now, there are there's actually a few more, but kind of the three primary reasons that we will see within the Gospels of why Christ is rejected by the Pharisees. Number one, he claimed to be God. Number two, he associates with people he shouldn't associate. And this isn't the first time that'll happen either. This isn't the last time. This is the first time, but it won't be the last time, right? And he rejects the oral law or the tradition of the Pharisees. This last one is the one that we see getting the most traction in the Gospels, because Christ from this point on does nothing but step on their laws. Like he goes out of his way sometimes to break Pharisaic law. Not just accidentally, not just tangentially where he's, just off doing something and it's like, oh, I'm sorry about that, guys. Didn't mean to break your law. Like, he will go, and I'll point it out, he will go out of his way to break their law. And they will erupt on him. Like, it's bad enough you claim to be God, but now you're breaking our oral tradition, right? So keep that in mind, that this is what's going on. And by him feasting at Matthew's house, we can assume that this was a designated fast day and that he's breaking Pharisaic law. So not only the Pharisees watching him eat with these lowlifes, they're watching him break his law. Oh, these people are filthy lawbreakers. That's what's going on. Just these lawbreakers. Look at them.
Were the Pharisees like watching from the windows or hiding in bushes? Were they in Matthew's house with them? Like what was their, or do we know what their position was?
We don't know. I mean, like I said, it was custom. The hospitality is that you would allow people to come into your house for dinner. So we even see this in a Pharisee's house where the woman comes behind Christ and she, anoints up, puts a perfume on him. Well, they would not have necessarily invited her in, but common hospitality would have allowed that person, they could have come in. So whether they're outside looking through the windows Whether they have actually walked inside, we don't really know. It doesn't say, but it wouldn't be uncommon necessarily for someone to enter in and be given hospitality to come inside the house, is what I'm saying. Okay.
So the thing about oral law is that the opposite of it is written?
Yes.
Okay.
So when God, and this is what we're going to get into, when God gave the law to Moses, he gave 613 commandments. That's the written law. The oral law is what the Pharisees made up. It's tradition. It's man-made law. But to them, and this is what I have down here, by the time of Christ, it had become sacrosanct. In other words, they viewed it as the same level because they had this idea of two Torahs, two laws. They believed that Moses, when God gave Moses the laws on Mount Sinai, he gave 613 commandments that Moses wrote down. And then he gave all these other 1,000 laws to Moses that Moses didn't write down. And then Moses passed it on to Joshua, who passed it on to the judges, who passed it on. So in other words, all of our laws, this is their claim, all of the laws that we have, God gave us. Therefore, they're God's laws. So when you break our law of fasting, you're breaking not our law, you're breaking God's law. So that's how they looked at it. And Christ was like, nope, God did not give Moses that. What God gave Moses, Moses wrote down. Okay, that's the difference. Does that all make sense?
Does that imply then that those oral laws that Moses gave the Jews were not from God, but
He
just
didn't.
ones that he kind of made up?
No, Moses didn't give them oral laws. He wrote down all the laws. Moses wrote down in.
I thought you just said that there were the written laws, the 613, and then there were the other.
No. What I'm
ones that they got.
No.
I thought you said
No,
this
no.
From Moses.
No. I'm saying the Pharisees, the way that you
They
make,
made them up,
yeah, but the way you substantiate that,
yeah.
because if you just make a law up, I can be like, that's not the Bible. So the way that they got around this is to say, oh, no, hold on a second. God gave Moses these laws, but he didn't write them down. They're oral laws. So, but God didn't do that. That's just their way of justifying that their laws are on the same level as the Mosaic
So
law.
there's no evidence that what they're saying.
No.
God gave Moses these non-written down laws. Has any.
No, in
there's
fact,
no evidence of
So-
that.
No, in fact, Christ will even say, he'll call it the tradition of the elders or the tradition. And what he's talking about there is he's talking about these quote oral laws.
Right.
And this isn't from God. So in other words, this is just their way of justifying that you need to obey what we say. But it wasn't what God gave Moses. Moses did not get these laws. Well, don't worry, we'll get to that here in a second.
You go to a Brooklyn subway station. See.
All right. So I'm gonna go through, here's a quick brief history to give you the idea what's going on. So what we have here again is when the Jews came back from Babylonian captivity. Remember, they came back, and Ezra the scribe, what he do is he took God's law and then he exposited that to the people. He taught them how to obey God's law, right? And so he was a scribe, Ezra was a scribe. So starting with Ezra, there was a school of the scribes, or they were called the Sofer, the Sopharim. So Sophar means to count, right? And they counted all the different, ways. For instance, they had like 39 modes of labor prohibited on the Sabbath. So they would say, 42 of this and 7 ways of not to do that. So because they did things in these numbers, they were called Sophers, right? And it started with Ezra. Ezra, what he did was absolutely fine. But the people from Ezra, that's when they started doing things that were not correct, right? So over a period of time, these Sofer, what they basically said was this. They would say, look, we know the reason. The fence, we talked about this before, so I'm going to go over it very quickly. When they said that, hey, look, the reason why we went into Babylonian captivity is because we broke God's laws. So what they said is, we're going to create these laws, this fence, this red part, this fence around God's laws, so that you might break our laws, but you won't break these. So they created these laws. And I give you, for instance, here that in Exodus and Deuteronomy, the Jews were forbidden to take a baby goat and milk its mother and then boil the baby goat in its mother's milk and then eat it, because that was a pagan ritual, a fertility rite. So God said, you can't do it. Well, by the time we got here to this time of, past Ezra, between the time of Ezra and Christ, there weren't any more Canaanites doing this. They've been wiped out. So no one was boiling baby goats in its mother's milk. But they said, well, gosh, we don't want to break that. And here's what might happen. It could be possible that the milk I'm drinking has come from the mother. Maybe we milked the mother this morning, and maybe the goat that we're eating is this baby goat. And when I eat my lunch, I might be eating the baby at the same time I'm drinking its mother's milk. And then when they both go into my stomach, what happens?
You're cooking them.
You're cooking them. Your acid, the juices cook it. And so this would be breaking God's law. But then what they said is, so they said, you're not allowed to eat dairy and meat at the same time. You had to separate them by, yeah, you had to separate them out, right? So, but the problem, what they said is that's not, they said, but it could even be this. What happens if the plate you're eating on has a piece of cheese on it? And you're washing it and you think it's all scrubbed up, but you don't get that piece of cheese off. And then tomorrow you're eating goat, but you're not eating any cheese, or not drinking milk, whatever else, but you're eating some lamb, and all of a sudden it picks up that little speck of cheese. And now you eat it and you're boiling the baby in its mother's milk. So they then came up with the law that not only could you not eat dairy and the meat at the same meal, they had to be separated by I think 4 hours, but you also had to have separate dishes. So if you go to a Jewish home today, even usually non-Jewish, they'll have two sets of dishes, one for meat, one for the cheese and dairy.
Jewish restaurant, very.
That's right.
That's hideously kept up.
It's because of this. So what these Sofer did is they kept on building onto this wall, right? And the idea is you could, Sofer could disagree with the Sofer, but they couldn't, disagree with the Mosaic law. That's kind of how this went. And I won't go through all these quotes here. I'll leave them up for you if you want to. We've been through this lesson before. I just wanted it as a reminder. Then after them, now this is the time of Christ, a new group of people came out, these scribes. They were called the Tana or Tanaim, and they were from the great Rabbi Hillel to Yehuda Hanasi, Judah the prince, in 220 AD. So these are the people that were around during the time of Christ. And they basically said, hey, a Tana can disagree with a Tana. We can disagree about what laws are, but we can't disagree with a Sofer. So in other words, all the laws that the Sofer put in place are now sacrosanct. You can't disagree with those, even though you and I might disagree as Tana. We can't disagree with a Sofer. And what they did is they built more laws. They said, look, the red fence that was built by the Sofer, it's not enough. People can still break God's law. So then they added all their own laws on top of that, thousands of laws. Like there was over 1,000 laws about the Sabbath that these people added, right? Just to that. And then you get the Amoraim or the Amora, and they were after the time of Christ, but you can just see how this has gone. In fact, Judaism today, rabbinic Judaism today, is worse than it was in the time of Christ, because this third group hasn't even come on the scene yet, and they added way more laws than the other ones. So oh no, that was actually prescribed in the Mosaic law, the flag. Yeah, that is. I'm talking about the thousands of laws. They had over 1,000 laws. God gave one law regarding the Sabbath. They added 1,000. Right? There's ridiculous stuff. Like you can't. There's only a certain distance you could travel on the Sabbath. Otherwise, you'd be breaking it. Right? So what they would do is they would take an item from home with them. They take items from home, and then what they do is they'd walk the amount of distance they could go, and they'd set the item down, because the item then represents, I'm still home. Then they walk along and they drop some more. So you could walk as far as you wanted, as long as you had items from home to bring with you, because home is where the heart is. Apparently home is where my spatula is, right? But it's these things that they did to try to get around these laws. All right, I'll just skip past that. All right. Anyway. Let me get to the part here. So, but again, the point here is this, is by the time of Christ, these laws of the Sofer and Tana had become equal with that. And the way they justified it was, oh, I know Moses didn't write them down. I know you can't go to the Bible and see any of these, but guess what? Moses received these from God, and he just didn't write them down. They're our oral tradition. And therefore, you can't break them, right? Now, let's get to fasting here, because I do want to finish this off. I know I'm 1 minute over, but let's just get to this fasting here. The fasting law was not part of the Mosaic law. It was the Pharisaic law. So Christ was under no obligation to obey this law, just so you know. He wasn't sinning at all right? Now, according to the Pharisaic law, fasting they would fast twice a week, right? They'd fast on Mondays and Thursdays, right? And so this is where, like in Luke 18, you see the Pharisee, right? The Pharisee standing by himself, prayed thus, God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, tax collectors, right? Unjust adulterers, right? Or even like this tax collector, right? There we go. Oh my goodness, this pulls us right back to Matthew. I fast twice a week, and I give tithes of all that I get. So they fast twice a week. So they're fasting on a Monday and a Thursday. So when this Pharisee is standing up, it's either a Monday or Thursday. We don't know, but it's one of those 2 days. And fasting was particularly ordered when there was something that was, an issue going on that was detrimental to the public. So in other words, and this is what Shura says, I should have put a quotation mark in the front. Public or general fasts, which were ordered especially on the failure of rain in autumn and at all times of public misfortune, were always delayed to the 2nd and 5th days of the week, Monday and Thursday, and so that they always began on the 2nd. Thus, a 3 days fast would fall upon the 2nd, 5th, and 2nd, right? Monday, Thursday, Monday. And a 6 days fast would then continue on the 5th, 2nd, and 5th, right? So it was always a Monday, Thursday, Monday, Thursday. So if you're going to fast, it was a Monday or Thursday. So, what we have there then is that this conversion of Matthew, if the timing is correct, if it's the same day, and I think it is, because the reason why they're now talking about why aren't you fasting is because Jesus is now eating, right? It's at this occasion where this happened. So the conversion of Matthew likely happened on a Monday or Thursday. So there you go. Maybe a little extra trivia there. Now, Christ answers their objections. Why don't you fast? And this is what he says. He says, can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. If he does, the patch tears away from it, the new from the old, and a worse tear is made. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is destroyed, and so are the skins. But new wine is for fresh wineskins. And of course, Luke adds that old wine is better than new wine. All right. So Jesus gives 4 responses to why doesn't he fast. The first one is the wedding analogy. And he basically is just saying this. Hey, look, when you go to a wedding, you don't fast. Like, fasting is a sign of mourning typically. It's when there's something going on. And fasting is usually typically a sign of mourning. It's an austere occasion. But when you go to a wedding, you don't do it. You party, man. You eat, you drink, and you eat. And guess what? I am the bridegroom, Christ is saying, and as long as the bridegroom is here, guess what? Party's on. We're going to eat. Anybody says, but there will be a day, as long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them. Again, now he's predicting that he will not be with them forever, right? This should be a foreshadowing to his disciples. And then they will fast in that day. So he's just saying, look, I mean, no one fasts at a wedding, and I'm the bridegroom and I'm here. So guess what? My disciples will continue to party as long as I'm here, right? The second one is about the garment analogy. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. If he does, the patch tears away from it, and the new from the old, and the worse tear is made. And all he's basically saying there is this. You know, look, if you got an old garment that's been washed and dried a whole bunch of times, it pretty much is shrunk as much as it can be. And then you stick a new piece on there. That piece you sew it on, that is going to shrink. And all of a sudden, it's either going to tear the patch away from the old cloth, or it's going to make this weird, it's going to distort the fabric because it's going to be shrinking in, right? And so his application is this, is that, hey, look, you know, I didn't come to make new laws to the Pharisees. The Pharisees were trying to put all these new patches. They were trying to patch up all the holes by putting these fences around there. I didn't come to patch up the Mosaic law. The Mosaic law doesn't need any holes. There's no holes in the garment, but you want to create holes and keep putting these patches on. And all it does is just tear the whole thing apart. So he's basically saying, we don't need your new patches, Pharisees. The old is good. God gave the Mosaic law. That's good. That's the thing we should be following. Does that make sense? Okay. Oh,
That's awesome.
you're welcome, Rich.
No, really.
Yeah, okay.
I can understand.
Yeah, Rich.
I'm no real, I mean, thank you. That was-
Well, it's not my, that's,
Certified here on the clock.
yeah, I am on the clock, so yes, quick. Yep.
John the Baptist had 2 goals: to lead people to repent of their sin and to prepare them for Christ's coming. John's message was sobering, so he had his followers fasting. But Jesus came, and there's your answer.
Yeah, well, but the reason why they were fasting isn't because of that. The text even says, why don't you fast like us and the Pharisees?
Tradition.
Yeah, that's right. It had, so as much as I would agree about the coming and everything else, that's not why they were fasting. They're fasting because that's what you do. I mean, for 400 years, this is what we've been doing. I mean, it's tradition, right? Okay, so the next one he gives is the wineskin analogy. No one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins and the wine is destroyed and so are the skins. But new wine is for fresh wineskins. And again, his analogy is, hey, look, the wineskins were made out of sheep and goat skins. And after they had been used several times, they would have expanded to the part as much as they could, and then they lose their flexibility. And then if you put new grape juice in there and then it goes to the fermentation process, it expands so much that it just bursts and it ruins the wineskins. And then you can't use it for anything. So what he's saying here is that the application, and I like how Arnold says, he says, Yeshua, Jesus, did not come to put his teachings into the skin or mold of the Pharisaism. He was presenting something that was new, and the old cannot be mixed with the new. The new teaching requires new ways of looking at religious practice. So they wanted to basically to put this new wine in the old wineskin. These new teachings, these new laws in there, and Christ says, if you do that, the thing just bursts, because that's not how it is. The old is okay. The old is good, right? The Mosaic law does not need to be amended by your Pharisaic laws, is what he's saying, right? So basically what he's doing is he's rejecting Pharisaic law. That's what he's saying is, I don't fast because it's Pharisaic law and I don't need to. I mean, besides the bridegroom's here. Now, the other one is the old wine analogy. He says, and no one after drinking old wine desires new wine, right? Now, I'm not a wine drinker, but for those of you that are, you know that like old wine is better than new wine. It's supposed to be smoother and has better taste and everything else. And you don't want to go out and get a wine that was just bottled 2 months ago. Better to get something that was bottled, I don't know, 20 years ago. I don't know. I'm not a wine expert, but apparently old wine is better. And what he's saying here is that this new wine is Pharisaic Judaism. And if God has given the old wine, which is the Mosaic law, which is biblical Judaism, it's better. And the new stuff you're having is not better. So I'm staying with the old and I'm not incorporating the new. Okay, all makes sense? Okay. Now, I'm just going to end it with this, is that we have to be careful about Christian legalism because we can become just like the Pharisees, right? We make up all kinds of laws. You can't go bowling. You can't go play cards. You can't have a tattoo. You can't smoke a cigar. I mean, look, like there are so many things that you either, if you do it, you're just not a Christian, or if you do it, you're a bad Christian, right? That's, you know what I'm talking about? Like lots of things that we come up with. I mean, can't have long hair. I don't know. You can't. You can't. Women can't wear pants. They gotta wear. I mean, I don't know. Whatever. Look, there's as many Christian laws that are not biblical that we made up that it's as anything you can think of. So here's the thing: don't fall into this trap. And what I have up here is this: if you have a way of living that you believe for yourself is the best way for you to live, to be obedient to Christ, that's fine. Right? Like if I know, now I'm just going to pick something that doesn't appeal to me at all. I'm not a drinker. Alcohol, horrible. I can't stand it. I will not find myself tempted to go into a bar. You can sit me in a bar all day long and throw as many drinks past me, not a big deal. That's because it doesn't appeal to me, right? But I can't say to everyone else like, hey, it's fine. Go do whatever you want. Take as many drinks as you want, because for you, that may not be the thing for you, right? Okay. But if I have something in my life where I say, look, there's certain things I don't want to watch because I know what will happen to me if I watch that. I know where it will lead me to go if I watch that. You may not have the same issue. You may watch it, no big deal, but that may lead me astray. That may be a personal rule for myself that's pragmatic, so that I know where my proclivities to sin are, and I know exactly how I need to guard as a guardrail. What I cannot do, though, is make that a universal rule for you. I can't tell you, you can't go do that just because it happens to be my weak spot. Does that make sense? And if I do adopt it for myself, I can't use it as a means of either justification. In other words, if I do this, I will be saved. It has nothing to do with this. Or as a means of sanctification, right? It can be used for me personally to say, look, I'm putting guardrails in my life. That's fine. But when we progress past there, which is almost always what we do, and we look down our noses at other people that don't put the same guardrails in their life, and they're less Christians or not Christians at all, that's where we fall.
Do you think that same kind of logic applies? You know, people make comments about whether or not a person's saved or not.
Sure, sure. I mean,
That-
yeah.
That guy can't be saved. I mean,
I-
how do you know?
Look, I had someone in dearly departed person, loved her to death. But I remember when I was 12, she must have been like in her 60s. And Matthew Ward, the Matthew Ward, the second chapter of Acts, you know, the singer. Anyway, I remember I showed it to her and said, hey, listen, I got the newest Matthew Ward tape. And she looked at the cover and Matthew Ward had long hair. And she looked at it and she goes, well, he's not a Christian. I said, well, what do you mean? He's got long hair. And I said, so have you listened to his music? I mean, he glorifies Christ and everything else. And she said, Christians don't have long hair. So therefore he cannot be a Christian. It's like, he's not a Christian. No, he can't. Christians will not have long hair. And that was it. So this is the thing that you're right, Rich. We tend to do this, and I have done this many times in my life. I go, either that person can't be a Christian, or guess what? That person's less. And usually what it is that person's less than me. Like, I actually keep my nose pretty clean. But you know how that person lives? Like, so it's really, it is very much that mindset that we get into. Have your pragmatic rules for yourself that are guidelines, perfect. But if it's not biblical, don't apply it to somebody else.
There's this, you know, for me, there's a couple of situations where I've known people, in my family and friends who confessed Christ or who wanted to confess Christ. Very late, and then a couple cases as they were dying.
Mhm.
And then, you know, people that knew that, there's no way he's going there. And in some cases, you know, the person saying that, you know, wished, you know, eternal suffering. I won't say what they said, but it was pretty.
Actually, remember the grumbling. It's the grumbling right there. Like, how dare you actually turn these people around? Like, that person deserves to burn in hell.
Right.
That's the comment. I mean, well, no, seriously.
Yeah.
But you think about that. You think about the heart of that person. But guess what? You know what? Look, there have been a few times when I've been about as close as that comment as well in my life. And so I can look at that and go, we shouldn't do that. But I know I've been there. I've been super judgmental,
Well, I think the point
a
is,
legalist. Yeah, yeah. All right. So anyway, just as the wrap up, you can see now 3 things have happened. Christ is claimed to be God. That's a big no-no. Christ is associated with people that is against their Pharisaic law. He's broken their law. And guess what? Christ has fasted. When he shouldn't be fasting, Christ didn't fast, sorry. Christ is eating when he should have been fasting. So within about a 24-hour period, he's gone from them coming to the house. I'm going to wrap it up with this. He's come to the house, they've come to the house and they're expecting that perhaps this is it. They've come from all over the place. He's just healed the leper and whatever else. They come there, and within 24 hours, he has done just about everything he can to blow it up. Like, he's got as many sticks of dynamite, and he's thrown them right in the middle, and he's blown the whole thing up. And so within like 24 hours, in 24 hours, he's gone from he might be the Messiah to this person's got to die. And from now on, that's what it is. He's got to die. And so that the tone of the Gospels after this event, within this like 24-hour period, goes dramatically south, and it doesn't ever recover. So that's your answer. If you've been asking the question, like, how could they do it? I'm trying to give you the steps of how that has actually occurred. All right. With that said, we do need to end here. It is 8 o'clock. Does anyone want to close in prayer? Anybody? Yeah, great.
Lord, thank you for this wonderful teaching tonight, and just ask that you would help us to continue to deepen our understanding of who you are and how to live according to your word, and help us to answer your call to follow you. I just pray that as we would go out into the rest of our week, that we would remember what we've learned tonight and be able to apply it to the best of our ability. Thank you for being our Lord and Savior. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you. Thank you, everyone online. We'll see you next week.